December 16th, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. The metal ladle felt warm in Master Sergeant Henry Soames's gloved hands as he stood exposed in the makeshift field kitchen, scanning the fog-shrouded tree line through the pre-dawn darkness. His orders that morning had been clear, almost desperate. "Get something hot in these men, Soames. Anything. They're freezing to death in those foxholes." But standing there, 6 miles from Bastogne with the distant rumble of German artillery behind him, Soames knew one truth that nearly 11 months of combat feeding had burned into his consciousness. In war, food was not just sustenance, it was survival. The field kitchen beneath his supervision, painted with the words "Rolling Restaurant" in white block letters, represented the third such operation he had established in the Ardennes in the past week. The first two had been hastily abandoned as the unexpected German offensive pushed American lines back. This one, in less than an hour, would become the epicenter of a culinary revolution that would transform the most fundamental aspect of the American war machine: how it fed its fighting men. The morning air carried the smell of wood smoke and the rich, unfamiliar aroma of his experimental stew. Soames could hear the rumble of jeeps moving into position, the clanking of mess kits on metal, the low voices of soldiers emerging from their frozen foxholes, drawn by the promise of hot food. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the forest and snow-covered fields around Bastogne, German panzer divisions waited, having punched a massive bulge in the American lines. Soames had faced this pressure dozens of times over the past months. He had learned to respect the urgency, to fear the consequences of failure, but never to let that fear paralyze his culinary instincts. His entire philosophy of combat feeding rested on one principle: calories sustain bodies, flavor sustains souls. "Chief, German shells getting closer," muttered Corporal Ray Jennings, Soames's assistant, as he stirred the 30-gallon pot with a wooden paddle nearly 6 feet long. "Battalion CP says we might need to displace." Soames nodded, but continued ladling the thick, aromatic stew into the insulated containers that would transport it to the forward positions. The operation had to continue. Men who hadn't eaten hot food in 3 days were counting on him. The recipe in his breast pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Captured from a German field kitchen during the fighting in Italy, the water-stained paper had revealed cooking techniques Soames had never considered possible under battlefield conditions. The German approach, slow cooking tough meat with root vegetables in a carefully spiced broth, required half the usual fuel and transformed even the most unpromising ingredients into something remarkable. Most importantly, it delivered nearly twice the effective calories of standard army stews, because soldiers actually ate it all. At 38, Soames stood older than most of his staff, a successful New Orleans chef drafted despite his age, because the army needed his skills more than his trigger finger. His weathered face, creased from years over hot stoves and now windburnt from months of outdoor cooking, betrayed a mixture of determination and resignation. The black-rimmed glasses he wore were speckled with tiny dots of grease that never seemed to come clean. "Master Sergeant, request permission to begin distribution," called Private First Class Thomas Wilkins, the youngest member of Soames's kitchen crew at barely 19. Wilkins stood by the 3/4-ton truck loaded with the insulated food containers, engine already running, condensation from his breath-forming icicles in his thin mustache. "Proceed to Baker and Charlie companies first," Soames ordered. "They've been on the line longest. Delta can wait another 30 minutes. The stakes couldn't be higher. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans had amassed 4 panzer divisions for this offensive. American troops, thinly spread and caught by surprise, were fighting in temperatures that plunged to 15 degrees below zero. Without adequate nutrition, they wouldn't just lose the fight, they would freeze to death in their foxholes. What had begun 11 months ago as Soames's private experiment was now feeding over 12,000 men in this sector alone. By next month, if his training program continued to expand, his adapted German recipe would feed more than 100,000 American troops daily across the European theatre. A distant explosion rocked the forest, closer than the previous barrages. Soames instinctively ducked, then straightened, embarrassed. "You're a cook, not a rifleman," he muttered to himself. But as he watched Wilkins's truck disappear into the fog, carrying the steaming containers to men who would fight another day because of what was inside them, Soames understood that the line between combat and support had blurred. His ladle was saving as many lives as any rifle. "Last batch, Chief," Jennings reported, scraping the bottom of the massive pot. Soames nodded, checking his watch. 0545 hours. They had produced over 200 gallons of high-calorie stew in less than 4 hours, enough to feed an entire battalion of frozen, exhausted men. The distinct whistle of incoming artillery broke his concentration. This barrage would land close, too close. "Everybody down!" Soames shouted, diving beneath the heavy steel cooking table as the first shells exploded at the edge of their position. For a moment that stretched to eternity, the world became noise and flying debris. Then, as suddenly as it began, the barrage lifted. Soames emerged to find his kitchen still intact, though a shell crater smoked just 30 yards away. "Anyone hurt?" he called out. His 6-man crew emerged unscathed, though visibly shaken. The near miss had made one thing abundantly clear. They were no longer in a support position. They were on the front line. "Pack it up," Soames ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "We're displacing 2 miles west. I want this kitchen operational again in 90 minutes. As his crew rushed to dismantle the field kitchen, Soames patted the recipe in his pocket. How a New Orleans chef had come to possess a German cooking technique that would transform the fighting capability of an entire army was a story that began almost a year earlier on the war-torn coast of Italy, where desperation and culinary intuition had collided to create an unlikely weapon in America's arsenal. January 15th, 1944, New Orleans, Louisiana. The copper pots hung precisely spaced along the kitchen wall of Soames' Creole kitchen on Decatur Street, gleaming in the early morning light that filtered through tall windows. Henry Soames ran his fingers along the edge of his prize chef's knife, testing its sharpness before beginning the day's preparations. At 48, his restaurant had finally achieved the success he'd spent 20 years building, recognition in the Times-Picayune, a loyal clientele of locals and visiting dignitaries, and the financial security that had eluded him during the Depression. The morning smelled of chicory coffee and rendered andouille fat, the foundation of the day's gumbo. Soames moved with the practiced efficiency of a chef who had mastered his space, his movements economical, his hands never idle. He'd opened the restaurant in 1928 after apprenticing under Chef Célestin Chenier, transforming a decrepit oyster bar into one of the French Quarter's hidden culinary gems. The letter from the draft board sat unopened on his desk in the small office behind the kitchen. At 38, with a successful business deemed non-essential to the war effort, Soames had known this day would come eventually. The manpower needs of a global war cared little for a man's age or civilian accomplishments. 3 weeks later, Soames stood on the parade grounds of Fort Lee, Virginia, home of the quartermaster school, wearing an ill-fitting uniform that chafed at his neck. The wooden barracks smelled of pine disinfectant and wool uniforms, a far cry from the aromatic complexity of his restaurant kitchen. His fellow trainees, mostly younger men with limited cooking experience, eyed him with a mixture of respect and wariness. A professional chef in their midst raised expectations. "This ain't no French restaurant, Soames," barked Master Sergeant Walter Green during their first day of instruction. Green, a career army man who had fed troops in the previous war, stood before a massive M1937 field range. The olive-drab cooking apparatus, mounted on a 2-wheeled trailer, looked more like industrial equipment than a kitchen tool. "You'll learn to feed 500 men in 90 minutes with this equipment, or you'll wash pots until your fingers bleed." Soames struggled initially with the scale and constraints of military cooking. The Army's standardized recipes, printed in precise measurements on index cards, left no room for intuition or improvisation. The emphasis on speed and volume contradicted everything he had learned about proper cooking technique. The ingredients heavily weighted toward canned and dehydrated components, seemed chosen for shelf stability rather than flavor or nutrition. "We're not here to please their palates," Green explained during a rare quiet moment between training exercises. The older NCO had taken an interest in Soames, recognizing his frustration. "We're here to keep them alive." "With all due respect, Sergeant, these men deserve better than this slop," Soames replied, gesturing toward a pot of rehydrated powdered eggs that had the consistency of wet cement. Green's weathered face softened slightly. "You know who said an army marches on its stomach?" "Napoleon," Soames answered immediately. "That's right. And Napoleon's army starved to death in Russia because his supply lines collapsed." Green placed a hand on Soames's shoulder. "When you're feeding men who might die tomorrow, the meal you give them today matters more than you can imagine. They're not customers, Soames. They're your brothers." The conversation shifted something fundamental in Soames's perspective. He threw himself into mastering the technical aspects of mass feeding operations: fuel consumption rates for different cooking methods, portion control, rapid serving techniques, and field sanitation. He learned to break down and reassemble the field range blindfolded, to calculate precise quantities for feeding units of varying sizes, to organize kitchen crews for maximum efficiency. By March 1944, Soames had completed his training and received orders to deploy to North Africa, where American forces maintained supply operations for the Italian campaign. The voyage across the Atlantic in a crowded troop transport introduced Soames to the reality of seasickness, an affliction that seemed particularly cruel for a man responsible for feeding others. The North African sun beat down mercilessly as Soames supervised his first real-world feeding operation in Oran, Algeria. The temperature inside his tent kitchen reached 120 degrees, causing condensation to form on the metal ceiling and rain down on the cooking surfaces below. The challenge wasn't just preparing food. It was preventing spoilage in punishing heat with unreliable refrigeration. Soames watched with growing dismay as soldiers picked unenthusiastically at the standard army fare. Powdered eggs reconstituted with local water that tasted of chlorine. Spam slices fried to a leathery consistency. Dehydrated potatoes that never quite achieved the right texture. The worst offence was coffee brewed so weak it resembled dirty dishwater, a cruel deprivation for men far from home. "You're not in Louisiana anymore, Chef," Green commented, having been assigned to the same quartermaster unit. The older sergeant had become something of a mentor to Soames, a bridge between civilian cooking expertise and military feeding reality. "These men deserve better," Soames repeated his earlier sentiment, watching as soldiers dumped half-eaten portions into garbage cans. "Then give them better," Green challenged. "Within regulations." Soames began experimenting within the severe constraints of his position. He traded with local vendors for fresh herbs to add to the standardized recipes. He adjusted cooking times and techniques to coax more flavor from inferior ingredients. He bartered cigarettes for local olive oil to replace the rancid cooking fat in standard issue. Small changes, barely noticeable individually, but collectively transformative. In April, Soames received orders to transfer to Italy as Allied forces pushed northward following the Anzio landings. As he packed his equipment aboard the LST that would carry his unit across the Mediterranean, he couldn't know that the war was about to provide him with an unexpected culinary education, one that would transform him from a reluctant military cook into an innovator whose methods would feed an army and help win a war. February 8, 1944. Anzio beachhead, Italy. The rain fell in sheets, turning the coastal plain into a muddy nightmare. Soames stood under a leaking tarp, stirring a massive pot of what the army officially called meat stew, Type B. The brownish mixture bubbled without enthusiasm, its bland aroma barely cutting through the smell of wet canvas and gasoline from nearby generators. "They won't eat it," Soames muttered to Green, who stood beside him checking inventory lists. "Third day in a row of the same stew. Half of it came back uneaten yesterday." "They'll eat if they're hungry enough," Green replied, but his tone lacked conviction. The Italian campaign had stalled, with German forces controlling the high ground around Anzio and American troops dug into muddy foxholes. The weather, cold and wet, sapped morale faster than enemy fire. Men returned from the front lines with hollow eyes and shaking hands, as much from hunger and cold as from combat stress. Soames had established a routine in the 3 weeks since landing at Anzio. His field kitchen operated from 0400 to 2000 hours daily, producing 3 meals for a battalion of 847 men. Breakfast, powdered eggs and reconstituted milk. Lunch, cold K rations delivered to forward positions. Dinner, whatever the supply officers could provide, usually canned meat and vegetables boiled together. "Look at them," Soames said, nodding toward the chow line forming outside. Soldiers hunched against the rain, mess kits in hand, their expressions already resigned to another disappointing meal. They're fighting on half the calories they need. "War isn't a restaurant, Soames," Green reminded him, though with less conviction than usual. Soames had been keeping records. Average caloric intake, 1,800 per day, well below the 3,200 recommended for men in combat conditions. Protein consumption, inadequate. Vitamin content, minimal. He documented weight loss across entire platoons, increased cold weather injuries, and declining alertness during patrols. "We're killing them with bad food," Soames concluded, making a decision. "I'm going to talk to Captain Mills about trying something different." Before he could leave the kitchen, a jeep skidded to a halt outside. Lieutenant Parker, a young intelligence officer, jumped out. "Sergeant Soames, Captain Mills sent me. We captured a German field kitchen intact during the patrol. He thought you might want to see it before they scrap it." 20 minutes later, Soames stood inside an abandoned farmhouse 3 miles from the main American position. The German field kitchen was smaller than its American counterpart, but the organization impressed him immediately. Every pot, utensil, and component had a specific place, secured for transport with ingenious metal clasps. "They left in a hurry," Lieutenant Parker explained. "Our patrol surprised them during a meal service." Soames examined the German equipment with professional curiosity. The cooking surfaces showed signs of recent use. A pot still contained the remains of something that smelled surprisingly appetizing, despite sitting for hours. "What were they making?" Soames asked, bending to smell the contents. "No idea. We captured one of their cooks, though. Want to talk to him?" The German prisoner sat on a wooden crate outside, a lanky man in his 30s, with the resigned expression of someone who had expected capture eventually. "Sprechen Sie English?" Soames asked, using his limited German. "Yes, some," the man replied with a heavy accent. "I was chef in Munich before war." "A professional," Soames said, nodding with respect. "What were you cooking for your men?" "Feldküchen goulash," the German replied. "Field kitchen goulash. Special recipe for soldiers." Through halting conversation, Soames learned the German army had developed specialized recipes for combat conditions, focusing on maximum nutrition and morale impact rather than simply filling stomachs. The goulash used a slow cooking method that tenderized even the toughest meat while preserving nutrients normally lost in standard army cooking procedures. "May I see recipe?" Soames asked. The German hesitated, then shrugged. "War is over for me. I show you." He led Soames back to the kitchen and retrieved a water-damaged notebook from beneath a counter. The pages contained handwritten recipes with precise measurements and techniques, many marked with annotations about field modifications. "This is genius," Soames muttered, flipping through pages describing cooking methods he'd never considered. The Germans had approached field feeding as a science, with controlled studies on nutrition, fuel efficiency, and even flavor perception under stress. With the German prisoner translating, Soames copied the key recipes and techniques into his own notebook. The fundamental approach was revolutionary in its simplicity: longer cooking times at lower temperatures, heavy seasoning to combat taste fatigue, and careful layering of ingredients to create depth of flavor without additional resources. Back at his own kitchen, Soames immediately began experimenting. He modified the German goulash recipe to work with American ingredients, replacing unobtainable items with available substitutes. The first test batch, prepared for just 20 men from a rifle company, involved significant risk. Soames had diverted resources without official approval. "What is this?" asked a mud-covered corporal, examining the thick stew with visible chunks of meat and vegetables in a rich brown sauce fragrant with paprika. "Just try it," Soames urged. The transformation was immediate. Men who had been silently forcing down their meals now talked animatedly between bites. Several returned for seconds, something Soames hadn't seen in weeks. "This what the Germans eat?" the corporal asked, scraping his plate clean. "Not anymore," Soames replied with satisfaction. Word spread quickly. The next day, twice as many men appeared at Soames' kitchen rather than using other feeding stations. Captain Mills, initially skeptical, became an immediate convert after tasting the modified recipe. "How did you do this with our supplies?" Mills asked, visibly confused. Soames explained the German cooking method while showing Mills his modifications to standard field equipment, creating a secondary heat chamber that allowed for true slow cooking rather than direct heat. It uses half the fuel, reduces waste by 60%, and delivers nearly double the effective nutrition because the men actually eat it all, Soames explained, showing his meticulously kept records. "We need to implement this throughout the division," Mills decided on the spot. Not everyone shared Mills' enthusiasm. When Soames presented his findings to the quartermaster leadership, he faced immediate resistance. "We have standardized recipes for a reason, Sergeant," Colonel Wilson stated firmly. "The Army doesn't have time for gourmet cooking." "With respect, sir, this isn't about gourmet anything," Soames countered. "It's about combat effectiveness. I can document at least a 30% increase in caloric intake using the same base ingredients. That means stronger soldiers." What began as a cooking experiment was about to become a battle of bureaucracy, with the health of thousands of fighting men hanging in the balance. But Soames had something the Pentagon didn't: evidence that his food was making a difference where it mattered most, on the front lines. March 15th, 1944. Allied Headquarters, Naples, Italy. The presentation easel stood in the corner of the conference room, its charts and graphs meticulously prepared with coloured pencils and ruler straight lines. Soames adjusted his tie nervously as general officers and their staff filed into the wood-panelled chamber. The polished conference table, requisitioned from an Italian government building, reflected the overhead lights like still water. "Just stick to the data," Captain Mills whispered beside him. "The numbers will speak for themselves." Major General Mark Clark, commander of 5th Army, entered last and took his seat at the head of the table. His weathered face showed the strain of the stalled Italian campaign, where Allied forces remained bogged down against determined German resistance along the Gustav Line. "I understand you have a revolutionary approach to field feeding, Sergeant," Clark said without preamble, his tone suggesting he had attended the meeting out of obligation rather than interest. "Yes, sir." Soames moved to the easel and unveiled his first chart. "Over a 6-week period, we've been tracking the implementation of a modified field kitchen technique across 3 different rifle companies in the 36th Infantry Division." The data displayed in crisp columns told a compelling story. Company A, using standard Army feeding procedures, showed declining combat effectiveness metrics over the test period. Companies B and C, using Soames's adapted German techniques, demonstrated markedly improved scores across all measured categories. Average caloric intake increased by 42%, Soames continued, flipping to the next chart. Protein consumption up by 38%. Most significantly, combat readiness scores improved by 27% within 3 weeks of implementation. The room remained silent as Soames methodically walked through his findings. Weight measurements of infantrymen, documented cases of cold weather injuries, number of men reporting to aid stations with exhaustion. Every metric showed improvement in the units receiving the modified feeding program. "The key innovation isn't the recipe itself," Soames explained, demonstrating his modified field kitchen setup using a scale model. "It's the cooking method. By adapting our existing M1937 field ranges with this secondary heat chamber, We achieve slow cooking capability in field conditions. General Clark leaned forward, his interest visibly piqued. And fuel consumption. Reduced by 37%, sir. The method requires lower heat maintained over longer periods, rather than the high-heat, rapid cooking approach currently standard. This also allows us to use tougher cuts of meat that would normally be unpalatable. What about implementation costs? Asked a colonel from Quartermaster Corps. Minimal, sir. The modifications can be made in any field maintenance shop using existing materials. Training time for kitchen personnel averages 8 hours before they're proficient. The questions continued for nearly an hour, probing every aspect of Soames's program. The more skeptical the questioning became, the more confident Soames grew. He had anticipated every objection, documented every variable, prepared for every challenge to his methods. "Gentlemen," General Clark said finally, "I've seen enough. Sergeant Soames's program will be implemented across 5th Army effective immediately. Captain Mills, coordinates with division quartermasters to establish training teams. I want this system operational before the spring offensive." The decision rippled through the European theatre with surprising speed. By late April, Soames found himself leading a dedicated training unit, travelling between divisions to implement his feeding program. The modified recipe became known informally as Soames stew among the troops, though official documentation referred to it as Revised Field Ration Type G. The cooking method proved adaptable to varied conditions and available ingredients. In coastal areas, local seafood could be incorporated. In mountain regions, different root vegetables replaced standard potatoes. The fundamental technique, slow cooking with careful layering of flavors and precise timing, remained consistent regardless of ingredients. By early June 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the Normandy invasion, Soames received orders to transfer to England. The success of his program in Italy had caught the attention of SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, which wanted the feeding system implemented among units preparing for Operation Overlord. On the flight to London aboard a C-47 military transport, Soames reviewed the latest data from Italy. His program was now feeding over 200,000 troops daily across the Mediterranean theatre, with implementation expanding weekly. The nutrition reports from field hospitals confirmed what he had observed directly. Better-fed soldiers suffered fewer combat fatigue cases, recovered from wounds more rapidly, and maintained fighting effectiveness under extreme conditions. "Your work has not gone unnoticed at the highest levels," said Colonel James Richardson, who had been assigned as Soames's new commanding officer. The colonel handed Soames a file stamped classified. Inside, Soames found laboratory analyses from the Army Medical Corps detailing the nutritional profile of his modified recipes. Scientists had determined that the slow cooking method preserved vital nutrients typically destroyed in standard Army cooking procedures. More significantly, the improved flavor profile meant soldiers consumed nearly all provided calories rather than discarding unpalatable portions. The calorie efficiency alone would justify implementation, Richardson noted. But it's the morale factor that has everyone's attention. Hot, satisfying meals affect fighting spirit in ways we hadn't fully appreciated until your data quantified it. In the 2 weeks before D-Day, Soames worked 18-hour days, training kitchen crews for units designated for the initial landings. The pressure was immense. These units would be operating under the most challenging conditions imaginable, with limited resupply and extreme combat stress. "Remember, you're not just feeding them," Soames told each kitchen crew during training. "You're giving them the physical and mental strength to keep fighting when everything in them wants to quit. That extra minute you spend stirring the pot might save a dozen lives tomorrow." D-Day came, and with it, the massive logistical operation supporting the largest amphibious invasion in history. As reports flowed back from Normandy, Soames tracked the performance of his feeding program under actual combat conditions. The results exceeded even his expectations. Units implementing the modified feeding system reported lower casualty rates from non-combat causes, better recovery times for wounded men, and higher offensive momentum. Commanders began specifically requesting Soames-trained kitchen crews for their units. By September 1944, with Allied forces pushing toward Germany, Soames's feeding program had become standard across the European theater of operations. Over 100,000 American troops received daily meals prepared using his methods, with the number growing as training teams expanded their reach. The War Department formally recognized the program's impact in a confidential report to General Eisenhower. Sergeant Soames's nutritional innovation represents one of the most significant improvements to combat effectiveness implemented during current operations. Conservative estimates suggest his feeding program has the equivalent impact of adding one additional division to combat strength through improved soldier performance and reduced non-combat casualties. As Allied forces prepared for the difficult winter campaign ahead, Soames received new orders: implement specialized cold weather modifications to his feeding program. With German forces falling back to their own borders and desperate to stop the Allied advance, the coming months would test every aspect of American fighting capability, including the seemingly humble task of feeding an army in combat. December 16, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains, transforming the forest into a white nightmare. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero overnight, freezing water cans solid and turning diesel fuel to sludge. Soames moved through the makeshift kitchen he had established in a partially destroyed barn, his breath visible in the frigid air as he supervised the preparation of the morning meal. "Temperatures dropping again," reported Sergeant Willis, Soames's new assistant after Green had been transferred to the Pacific. "Weather boys say it might hit -20 by nightfall." Soames nodded grimly. The German counteroffensive had caught the Allied forces by surprise. Panzer divisions had punched through the Ardennes sector, creating a massive bulge in the American lines. Units were scattered, communications disrupted, and supply lines stretched to breaking point. Bastogne, the critical road junction that controlled access to the entire sector, was nearly surrounded. "How's our fuel situation?" Soames asked, checking the modified field stoves where 20 15-gallon pots simmered with a thickened version of his stew, adapted for extreme cold conditions. "Down to our last 50 gallons of white gas," Willis replied. "That's maybe 2 days of cooking at current consumption." Soames had anticipated the fuel shortage. His winter modification to the cooking system incorporated a heat retention system using insulated boxes built from ammunition crates lined with salvaged wool blankets. The method allowed pots to continue slow cooking for hours after being removed from direct heat, using half the fuel of standard field kitchens. "We'll make it stretch," Soames decided. "Double layer the insulation on the transport containers. Every degree we retain saves calories the men would otherwise burn staying warm." Outside, the distant thump of artillery punctuated the morning. German forces were tightening the noose around Bastogne, with elements of the 101st Airborne and scattered support units holding the town against mounting pressure. "Sir." "Colonel Adams on the radio," called a communications specialist. "He's asking about meal delivery to the forward positions." Soames took the handset, his fingers stiff with cold despite the gloves he wore. "Soames here." "Sergeant, we've got 3 companies dug in along the Houffalize Road." The colonel's voice crackled through static. "They haven't had hot food in 48 hours. Temperature in the foxholes is below zero. I need your assessment of the situation." Soames hesitated only briefly. "We'll get food for them, sir. Request transportation and a security detail." "Negative on both counts, Sergeant. Everything we've got is committed to the defence perimeter or evacuating wounded. If you go, you're on your own." The implications were clear. The forward positions lay through contested territory, areas where German patrols operated freely. Delivering food meant driving unescorted through potential ambush sites. "Understood, sir. We'll depart in 30 minutes. Soames turned to his kitchen crew, all of whom had heard the exchange. "This is volunteer only," he announced. "We'll be moving hot food containers to Baker, Charlie, and dog companies on the Houffalize Road. No escort, uncertain route security. Every man stepped forward. Guess that settles it, Soames said, hiding his pride behind a gruff exterior. Willis, prep the juice and a half. Johnson, Ramirez, load the insulated containers. The rest of you keep production going here. 30 minutes later, Soames sat in the passenger seat of the 212-ton truck as Willis navigated carefully through the snow-covered forest road. In the back, under canvas cover, 16 insulated containers held enough of the specialized high-calorie stew to feed 3 rifle companies, nearly 300 men. The meal had been modified for extreme cold conditions with higher fat content and additional spices to stimulate circulation. Movement, 2 o'clock, Willis murmured, slowing the truck. Soames reached for his M1 carbine, a weapon he had once considered unnecessary for a cook. 3 figures emerged from the forest, American uniforms caked with snow. "Hold your position!" called the lead soldier, raising his rifle. Soames rolled down his window. "Kitchen detail from 28th Division HQ. We're bringing hot food to Baker, Charlie, and dog companies." The soldiers lowered their weapons, disbelief evident on their frostbitten faces. "You're bringing chow through this?" "That's affirming. Can you direct us to the company positions?" The patrol guided them forward, moving slowly through increasingly dangerous territory. The sound of small arms fire echoed through the trees less than a mile ahead. "That's the perimeter," explained a sergeant from the patrol. "Germans have been probing all morning. Your timing's good. The boys are about frozen solid." The first distribution point came under mortar fire as Soames and Willis unloaded containers. They dove for cover behind the truck as shells exploded 50 yards away, throwing snow and debris skyward. "We've got to keep moving," Soames shouted over the explosions. "Each position gets 4 containers, then we roll immediately." At the second position, they found men who had been in foxholes for 36 hours straight, their uniforms frozen to their bodies, weapons covered with frost. A lieutenant approached the truck, his young face gaunt with exhaustion. "Hot food? Are you serious?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "Yes, sir. Enough for your entire company. High calorie, designed for these conditions." As the food was distributed, Soames watched the transformation. Men who had been hunched and silent straightened, their movements becoming more certain, voices stronger. The lieutenant approached again, this time with tears freezing on his cheeks. "You don't understand what this means," he said quietly. "We lost 6 men to exposure last night. Not wounds, just cold. This will save lives." The third position proved the most difficult to reach. German artillery had zeroed in on the approach road, making vehicle movement suicidal. Soames made a quick decision. "We'll carry the containers the last quarter mile," he told Willis. 2 men, 2 containers per trip. They had completed 2 trips, moving in short sprints between sheltered positions, when a shell landed 30 yards from their position. The concussion threw Soames against a tree, shrapnel tearing through his left arm and side. The pain was immediate and searing, but he forced himself up, continuing toward the American position with the insulated container still clutched in his right hand. "You're hit!" Willis shouted, appearing beside him. "Not stopping!" Soames gasped, the warm wetness of blood freezing against his skin in the sub-zero air. "These men need this food more than I need a medic." They completed the delivery, Soames growing weaker with each step, but refusing evacuation until all containers had been distributed. Only then did he allow himself to be loaded onto a jeep bound for the field hospital in Bastogne. As he drifted in and out of consciousness during the rough journey, Soames heard the radio operator in the jeep reporting to headquarters. Cook got the food through, men fighting again, temperature holding at -17. The surgeon at the field hospital removed 7 pieces of shrapnel from Soames's left side and arm, working in a basement operating theatre illuminated by gasoline lanterns as German artillery pounded the surrounding town. "You're a hell of a lucky man," the doctor told him afterward. "Half inch to the right, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. Soames spent 3 days in the crowded field hospital, refusing evacuation when limited air transport became available. "Send the critical cases," he insisted. "I can still work one-handed." By December 20th, Soames was back in his kitchen, arm bandaged but spirit unbroken. The data from the forward positions confirmed what he had witnessed personally. Units receiving his specialized cold-weather feeding recorded 62% fewer cases of exposure and cold injury than comparable units on standard rations. A colonel from 3rd Army Medical Corps visited Soames's position, clipboard in hand, expression skeptical until he reviewed the numbers. "This is remarkable," he admitted, examining Soames's records. "Your feeding program is saving more lives than many of our medical interventions." As the Battle of the Bulge raged into its second week, with American forces holding Bastogne against overwhelming odds, Soames's kitchen crews worked around the clock. His wounded arm throbbed constantly, but he refused to slow down, understanding that the coming days would determine not just the outcome of the battle, but the fate of thousands of men fighting in the most challenging conditions imaginable. On December 23rd, Soames stood outside his kitchen as Brigadier General McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, inspected the facility. The general had become famous 2 days earlier for his one-word response to German surrender demands. "Nuts! I'm told your feeding program is keeping my men fighting," McAuliffe said bluntly. "Is that accurate?" "We're doing what we can, sir," Soames replied. McAuliffe surveyed the operation, the modified cooking apparatus, the insulated transport containers, the carefully organized preparation areas, then nodded once. "Continue what you're doing, Sergeant," he ordered. It matters more than you know. May 8th, 1945. Paris, France. The soft spring sunlight filtered through the windows of the Hotel Crillon, illuminating the ornate conference room where General Eisenhower's staff had gathered to review the final reports from the European theatre. Victory in Europe had been declared just hours earlier, ending nearly 6 years of devastating conflict across the continent. The atmosphere was one of exhausted triumph. Men and women who had driven themselves to the limits of endurance, finally able to acknowledge that their work had achieved its purpose. Master Sergeant Henry Soames stood at attention, his uniform pressed perfectly for the occasion, the Bronze Star and Purple Heart medals gleaming on his chest. His left arm, still not fully recovered from the shrapnel wounds received during the Battle of the Bulge, remained slightly stiff as he presented his final comprehensive report on the Allied forces' feeding program. At peak implementation, the modified field feeding system provided meals for 127,432 combat troops daily across all Allied forces in the European theatre, Soames explained, his voice steady and professional, despite the emotion of the day. Statistical analysis indicates the program reduced cold weather casualties by 58%, improved combat effectiveness metrics by 37%, and decreased overall consumption of medical supplies by 22% compared to units on standard rations. Major General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, nodded appreciatively. "The numbers are impressive, Sergeant, but they fail to capture the full impact of your innovation. Field commanders report that your feeding program became a cornerstone of morale during the most difficult phases of the campaign." Soames acknowledged the compliment with a slight nod. The journey from reluctant draftee to architect of the Army's revolutionary feeding program had transformed him as much as it had transformed military nutrition. He thought briefly of the water-damaged German cookbook, now carefully preserved in his footlocker, that had sparked the entire revolution. "I've been authorized to inform you that the War Department has approved full integration of your feeding methods into the permanent Army Field Manual," General Smith continued. "The Soames method will be standard procedure for all US-made forces moving forward." The recognition meant more to Soames than any medal. His work would continue to serve soldiers long after he returned to civilian life, a legacy that would potentially save thousands of lives in future conflicts. February 12th, 1946, New Orleans, Louisiana. The brass bell above the door of Soames's new restaurant chimed softly as the first customers of the evening entered. Soames's home front occupied a corner location in the French Quarter, its windows overlooking streets still celebrating the return of peace, with a vibrancy that had been absent during the war years. Soames moved through the dining room with the same precision and authority he had demonstrated in field kitchens across Europe. The restaurant's concept was unique in post-war America, combining the comfort food that had sustained troops with refined techniques that elevated simple ingredients to extraordinary results. The centerpiece of the menu was Victory Stew, a civilian adaptation of the recipe that had fed 100,000 troops daily during the final push into Germany. The slow-cooked dish featured locally sourced ingredients prepared using the same fundamental techniques Soames had developed under combat conditions, though the presentation was considerably more elegant than metal mess kits had allowed. "The general's in the back room," murmured Soames's head waiter, a former staff sergeant who had served under him in Italy. Soames made his way to the private dining area where General Mark Clark, now commanding the US occupation forces in Austria, sat with several staff officers. Clark had made a point of visiting Soames's restaurant while on leave, maintaining the connection forged during the desperate days of the Italian campaign. "Sergeant, or should I say Chef Soames," Clark greeted him warmly. "I've been telling my staff about your remarkable contribution to our victory. Some of them still don't believe that a cooking technique could have a strategic impact." Soames smiled, comfortable now with the recognition his work had received. "With respect, General, good food has always had strategic impact. Napoleon wasn't wrong about armies marching on their stomachs. He just didn't have the right cook." The diners laughed, but Soames knew the truth behind his jest. Modern nutritional science had validated what his experience had demonstrated empirically. His cooking method preserved up to 62% more nutrients than standard preparation techniques, delivered sustained energy release over longer periods, and significantly improved protein utilization efficiency. A team from Harvard University had conducted extensive studies on Soames's methods in the months following the war, publishing findings that extended beyond military applications to civilian nutritional programs. The slow cooking approach proved particularly valuable for institutional feeding in hospitals, schools, and disaster relief operations. "I understand the Army is applying your methods in the Pacific Occupation Forces," Clark commented. "Initial reports indicate excellent results under very different climate conditions." Soames nodded. "The fundamental principles work regardless of the environment. The technique adapts to available ingredients while maintaining the core benefits." He didn't add that he had spent countless hours corresponding with quartermaster units in Japan and Korea, helping them modify his recipes for local conditions and available supplies. By 1950, as tensions on the Korean peninsula escalated toward open conflict, the Soames method had become fully integrated into US military doctrine. Combat rations had undergone complete redesign based on Soames's nutritional principles. Field kitchens incorporated his equipment modifications as standard features. Training manuals included entire chapters devoted to his approach. During the Korean War, the impact of these changes became immediately apparent. American forces operating in extreme cold maintained effectiveness that far surpassed their performance under similar conditions in previous conflicts. Medical reports documented significantly reduced rates of cold injury, combat fatigue, and recovery time from wounds. Soames followed these developments from his thriving restaurant in New Orleans, where he had expanded to 3 locations and published a cookbook adapting his military techniques for home cooks. Veterans frequently sought out his restaurants, often bringing families to experience the food that had sustained them during their darkest hours. "It tastes like hope," one former infantryman told his children as they sampled the Victory Stew for the first time. "When we were surrounded at Bastogne, freezing in our foxholes, this food reminded us that someone cared whether we lived or died." In 1955, the Army Quartermaster Museum at Fort Lee, Virginia, created a permanent exhibit honoring Soames' contribution to military nutrition. The centerpiece was the original water-damaged German cookbook, donated by Soames, displayed alongside the field-expedient cooking apparatus he had developed in Italy. Modern nutritional analysis, eventually explained the science behind Soames's intuitive breakthrough. The slow-cooking method preserved critical micronutrients typically destroyed by high-heat preparation. The specific combination of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats he had developed provided optimal energy release under combat conditions. The enhanced flavor profile stimulated appetite even under extreme stress, ensuring soldiers actually consumed the calories provided. A 1960 Department of Defense study concluded that Soames's feeding program had potentially saved as many as 7,400 American lives during the European campaign through reduced exposure casualties, improved combat alertness, and enhanced wound recovery. The report noted that these benefits had extended into subsequent conflicts, with the Korean War showing similar improvements in combat survivability attributable to improved nutrition. Perhaps most remarkably, Soames's influence extended beyond military applications into civilian disaster relief efforts. When Hurricane Audrey devastated the Louisiana coast in 1957, Soames organized emergency feeding operations using his combat-tested methods, providing hot, nutritious meals to thousands of displaced residents under challenging conditions. In his later years, Soames became a sought-after consultant for organizations facing mass feeding challenges in adverse conditions. The United Nations, Red Cross, and various disaster relief agencies implemented variations of his methods, adapting his principles to humanitarian operations worldwide. On May 30, 1978, at the dedication of the new quartermaster training facility at Fort Lee, an elderly Henry Soames stood before a new generation of military cooks and food service specialists. His hair had turned white, his once powerful frame somewhat diminished by age, but his eyes retained the intensity and focus that had driven him through the desperate days of the European campaign. "Food is never just fuel," he told the assembled soldiers. "It is a connection. It is home. It is hope. When you prepare a meal for a soldier in combat, you are giving them more than calories. You are giving them the strength to face another day, to remember what they're fighting for, to believe that someone cares whether they live or die." The most enduring legacy of Soames's innovation was not recorded in official histories or calculated in statistical improvements. It lived in the memories of countless soldiers who found momentary comfort in a hot meal during their darkest hours, tangible evidence that even in war's chaos, something fundamental to humanity remained intact.